Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event, our first in our new series, Novel Voices. My name is John McAuliffe, and I'm the director of the Centre for New Writing here at the University of Manchester. I'm really delighted to welcome you to our first event with J.A Mensah and Mong Jin being interviewed and in conversation with Ellah Wakatama. This time last year, our commitment to bringing new writers and new writing to Manchester was badly hit by the pandemic. And one series which was disrupted was my colleague Ellah's Complete Works, which had brought Gary Young, Christina Lamb, Aminata Forna, and others to the city. It was a really remarkable series and one that Ellah and I and our partners at the university's Creative Manchester initiative were very keen to follow up, in spite of the continuing conditions. The Centre for New Writing, as its title suggests, is all about new writing. And we are really excited to be starting this new Novel Voices project, which is going to focus on first-time novelists and their work. I'm going to introduce Ellah briefly now and also let you know about how the event is going to work tonight. As many of you know, Ellah Wakatama is Senior Research Fellow here at the University of Manchester, as well as being Editor-at-Large for Canongate Books. In 2011, she was awarded an OBE for services to the publishing industry, and since then, she has edited Africa 39 for Bloomsbury and the anthology Safe House, Explorations in Creative Non-Fiction for Cassava Republic. She has served on the judging panel of the 2017 Dublin Literary Award and the 2015 Man Booker Prize. There is no one I would rather guide me around the world of contemporary fiction. So, Novel Voices this semester introduces some of the best new fiction being published by debut authors. Voices many of you will be hearing for the first time tonight, who we hope you will be hearing from much more for many years to come. Before I hand over to Ellah, some housekeeping. Our great friends at the University, Creative Manchester, are our partners for this event. Blackwell's are our partner bookshop. We're delighted to be working with Blackwell's again, and any of you who have ordered books as part of your ticket tonight can expect them to arrive in the post. And I know Blackwell's are going to put links for where you can buy Mong and Juliana's novels in the chat shortly, so you can follow up on that tonight. Finally, there are a couple of buttons, as you all know, at the bottom of these Zoom screens, which you can use. The Q&A button is the one that you should use if you have any questions for Mong and Juliana across the evening. But we'd also like you to use the chat box. And if you can type into the chat where you're watching tonight, we'd really appreciate that. It's a very important part of these events, that sense of a reading community who have books in common. So please do let us know where it is you're watching us tonight. That's it from me, and I'm going to hand over now to Ellah.
John, thank you for that lovely introduction. I really love the idea of being a guide to reading around the world. One of the things that I always say is that my constant desire is to read the world. And so it's a huge pleasure to welcome all of you this evening to the first of our Novel Voices series. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce our first debut double, as it were. When I first conceived the series, I was frustrated that we wouldn't be able to be in the same place. But we do have a huge advantage with this digital platform in that it allows us to welcome one writer who lives in San Francisco but is currently in Florida, and another writer who is in York, here in England, and I'm in London. My colleagues are in Manchester, and I think the audience is from all around the world. So it's really lovely to be able to have that opportunity. I want to thank our partners at Blackwell's and also at Creative Manchester for making this evening possible, and especially Anne-Marie Nunez, who is our spectacularly well-organized colleague who has helped put all of this together, and my own assistant, Nikki. So let me introduce you to the writers. Mong Jin is an American writer whose work has appeared in the Pushcart Prize Anthology, Three Penny Review, Plowshares, and the Bare Life Review. She has an MFA from Hunter College and was the recipient of the David R.K. Wong Fellowship at the University of East Anglia. She was born in Shanghai and has lived in the UK and the US. Her debut novel is titled Little Gods, and it was published last year in the US by Custom House and is out this month from One, which is an imprint of the brilliant Pushkin Press. J.A Mensah teaches at the University of York. Her writing for theatre has focused on human rights and the testimonies of survivors. She has published short stories in collections by Comma Press and Dead Ink. Her debut was the winner of the inaugural North Brown Book Award and was also published this month by Saraband, an award-winning independent press based in Manchester. Jin and Meng and Juliana, first, congratulations, and secondly, welcome.
Thank you. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here.
I should have said that Juliana's book is titled Castles from Cobwebs. And in fact, I had these up, but my cat knocked them over, but here are the books. There you go.
I have mine too.
And they're yours too. Fab. I want to start, Juliana and Meng, with beginnings. Both of your novels explore a fractured bond between mother and daughter and a journey. As we were researching, my assistant Nikki and I were struck by the possible conversation that readers will find in these two books. One is set in the US and China, and the other in the UK and Ghana. These are both novels of diaspora and of homecoming. Your approaches are so distinct that it seemed to me that you had each managed to come up with a form that expands our ideas of what the novel can be in order to tell your stories. I'd like to start with you, Meng. When did the idea of Sulan and Leah first come to you? And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about them to set it all up.
Yeah, sure. I think that when I started writing this book 6 or 7 years ago, I always knew it was going to be about a mother and a daughter. And it took me a while to figure out who would be at the center of it, the mother or the daughter. And eventually, after writing and trying a lot of different forms, as you say, I settled on a form that to me felt like, this is going to sound maybe a little whimsical, but to me, it was like a black hole with planets circling around it and falling into it. And Sulan, the mother, was at the center. She was the black hole, the absence. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Sulan is a Chinese woman physicist who immigrates to the US after her husband disappears on the night of the Tiananmen Square massacre, which is also the night that her daughter Leah is born.
I think let's leave it there because we don't want to give any spoilers. But I'm really interested in that idea of sort of the absences. And rather than being whimsical, your idea of the planet circling around is really fascinating to me. And it means that in the end, you tell the story by showing us different views of Sulan from different people in her life. And to me, that was incredibly effective because as a reader, you made me work quite hard to put together this composite of a woman. And I wasn't sure I had the truth in the end. And I think that's what I meant about form as well. And I just wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that. Why did you do that?
Yeah, I think that for those of us who are writing from diaspora, often what is not there, what is not physically with us feels so much more present or just as present as what is with us. I think, that sort of longing for homeland does inform that form. Form of the book. Yeah, I also, as someone who lives between cultures and across cultures, I think I'm sort of distinctly aware of the ways in which we manifest different versions of ourselves in different worlds and with different people, and how that can mean that even the people who are closest to us and who love us most might not be able to see all of us. So I came up with this form, I guess, to create a portrait of a woman that is perhaps a little cubist, right? You can't see her from one direction fully, and you can sort of get a sense of the fullness of her personhood when you have these different pieces. Yeah.
So that make her up. You said that you began the book 6 or 7 years ago. I love these stories, and I just wondered what changed in the writing of it. Did your characters obey you, or did you obey them?
Oh my God, everything changed multiple times. I think because it was my first book, I was also learning how to write. So often by the end of one draft, I felt, I'd become a different writer. The book had changed me. And so I had to go back to the beginning and make sure that the beginning was me as well. And that resulted in many different drafts.
How amazing. Juliana, did writing Castles from Cobwebs change you?
It did. I was just grinning really hard then, listening to them talk about learning how to write in writing the novel and feeling that you're a different writer every time you get to the end of a draft. Because I feel very much as though I finished this book for my younger self. I feel like it was a much younger version of me that started this and wanted to write this story. And it's something I've carried with me for a while, and writing it taught me how to write the novel that I wanted to write. And the approach that I'm taking with a new project that I'm working on is actually very different. So with this book, I knew where I wanted the story to start. I knew the sorts of themes and the characters I was interested in looking at, but I didn't have a roadmap for where it's going to go. And so each draft felt, as Meng said, felt like a different book. And I felt like a different writer at the end of it. And I needed to come back and make sure that it hung together as one piece, and that it was something that was doing what I had intended in the beginning, even if I had slightly moved on towards the end.
Yes. I'm really interested in, I want to talk a little bit about Imani, your main character. She's entirely original, and the childhood you imagined for her had me in mind of a fairy tale. Not the Disney versions, but the sometimes like really scary Brothers Grimm fairy tales. And I wondered if you could tell us when you first encountered her and knew that she was going to lead us through this journey.
That's a really good question.
Take your time.
When I first had the idea, I think the idea of a character that grew up in that sort of setting had been with me for a long time, and was informed by early childhood reading. So I read things, I suppose, like Enid Blyton, where there are children in rural settings and they have nature as their playground. And I never saw people that looked like me in those stories. And so I think there was this longing to have a character in that sort of setting. But I was also working in Northumberland around 2007. And I was an arts officer there, and I was at a school, and a young boy came up to me and held my hand, and he asked me why I was Black. And the question really threw me. It felt like a very innocent question. And he was very young. I think he was 3 or 4. It was a primary school. And when I left and I was on my way home, I wondered what life would be like for a young Black girl growing up in Northumberland, and how she would come to understand her race. Because although he seemed very innocent, he also knew that I was Black and not brown. So he'd encountered the language of race at some point. And I wondered how that had come about and what that would be like for a young girl. And so I suppose that's the first time that I was thinking about what would she be like? How would she understand her difference? How would it make her feel about who she was? And Holy Island is a tidal island that's just off the Northumbrian coast. And certain parts of the day you can walk there on a causeway, and then at other parts the tide is high and it's completely cut off from the mainland. And so I set it there because there was something about the changes, the movements of the tide and the connection with the land that mirrored her sense of belonging and connection, and the transience of it, and the transience of her dislocation.
That link between sort of the geographical setting and what you wanted sort of as an interior way of being, to me, is incredibly powerful in your book. I'm going to invite you to read to us, but before you do, I wonder if you could just set it up a little bit and give us a very brief summary of the people we're about to meet and who they are. And
okay, so the book begins when Imani returns to the island, and it's a fictional version of Holy Island. It's called Holymead. And when she returns to the island, she encounters ghosts of her past self. I don't know whether to say too much, whether to just read, and then perhaps I'll say a little more.
Maybe just read, and then we'll see. Yes, just read for us.
So this is a short section from very early on in the book when she's just arrived. Okay. I'm back. It's winter again, and time has folded in on itself to confuse me. It offers reflections as keepsakes, then snatches them away before I can catch them. I see ghosts everywhere, in the gloom of the trees, the nooks and crannies of the lanes, in shop windows and out in the waves. A shadow crosses my path. My 19-year-old self steps out of the shop with a paper bag in her hand and a rucksack on her back. Her focus is on the contents of the paper bag. Peering inside, she inspects the sweets. She bundles the bag into the side pocket of her coat and looks up, straight at me. Squinting, she shields the glare of the sun with her hand, as though trying to see me more clearly. She pauses for a moment, then turns and walks away. My 12-year-old self nudges past me and drops a book in the brief collision. I bend to look at the fallen thing, but she snatched it up before I can read the title. I find myself running along to keep up with her and realize too late where she's heading. The large iron gates are confrontational, and the redwood trees beyond it cast huge shadows. 12 walks into the grounds and strides along the part of the main building. Cradling her books in one arm, she searches inside her satchel and retrieves a key, unlocks the door, pushes it open, and is gone. I'm left alone, outside. The old building looks frail and infirm in the winter sun. Light is so unforgiving. I've always preferred the warmth of darkness, where you can hide until you're ready to be seen. I open the gate tentatively and walk towards the first redwood tree that lines the path. I hesitate, then touch it, press my cheek against its spongy bark, and wrap my arms as far around its trunk as they will go. Voices from the distance pull me out of the embrace. A group of tourists has stopped, and they peer through the gate. I let go of the tree and walk towards the building, escaping their gaze. In front of the convent, I wait before knocking. I pick up the brass knocker and bang on the door as a guest might. The sound is deep and full. After a few moments, the oak door creaks and staggers open. Sister Alma smiles up at me. We stare at each other from opposite sides of the threshold. Me, the gangly dark Amazon. Her, the squat yellowing cherub. Her skin almost transparent now. We've missed you. Her words are whispered. Her eyes are wet. I've missed you too, I say. I'll read the next section and perhaps tell you a little about Imani's. So when she arrives on the island, as I say, she encounters these ghosts of her past self. And the poet Sean O'Brien says ghosts in literature are the embodiment of the past in the present. And there's some of that in Meng's book as well, which I noted. And I was interested in her encountering the past that she's conscious of when she encounters those ghosts. And the idea of Amory, who some of the nuns call her imaginary friend, others of the nuns call a demon, but she calls her shadow. The idea of that came about for me because I wondered, what would the embodiment be of a past that she's not consciously aware of?
Yes.
And so on the island, she has Amory, but when she leaves, Amory disappears. So this is the beginning of the second section where she has arrived in Ghana. Chickens cluck and gossip nearby. A car honks in the distance. Someone somewhere shouts a greeting. Wheels screech, several of them successively. I wait for the crash. It doesn't come. Voices rise in confused or angry chorus. A group of children chant a playground anthem. They clap and stamp in sync. I can't make out the words. The soft lap of a skipping rope beats the ground repeatedly. Something hits a window. A ball. I don't move to see it. Soupy air rests on my skin and the sun through the blinds crosses my cheek with a lick of dry heat that is surprisingly refreshing. The crisp light soothes against the cloying humidity. I open my eyes and close them. Open, then close. The ball hits the window again. Close eyes, open, close. I do that thing where your eyes are open behind closed lids. I watch the light filter through the skin that shields my gaze. The back of my eyelids glow ochre, brown. I'm brown again. I'd always known that I was brown. I don't remember it being a discovery, putting my arm up against Sister Alma and noticing the difference between us, paddling on the beach with Reverend Mother and realizing the contrast in our reflections as they rippled in the stream. There was no one moment when I suddenly knew. Amory was blackish grey and Mother was whitish pink. Amory was spirit and Mother was flesh. I was brown, somewhere between them, more flesh than Amory and more spirit than Mother. They were my coordinates and I knew where I was rooted between them. Black was different though. It came announced. It was the year the parish roof couldn't be repaired anymore. There had been so many patch jobs done, it was like an old quilt, all threadbare and no good at blocking water. That autumn, we had a ceilidh to raise money for a new roof, and Mrs. O'Shea from the village, Penelope Marie's mum, she told Sister Alma that I was a good dancer because all Black people have rhythm. And there it was. Suddenly I was Black. After that, there was a world outside with others who were Black like me, and this hunger formed. Perhaps it had always been there, as a cloud maybe. But it hardened, became granite in the pit of me. Every time Harold found another morsel about Black from Yahoo, I savoured it. But Black also made me dizzy. Like when you're little and you spin around, and then in the middle of spinning, you realise you can't stop and stand still, and you'll fall over if you try. Black came with expectations of rhythm and other things that might trip me up. At Heathrow Airport, there were people of all colours and combinations. I saw a woman, brown like me, with hair the colour of a postbox. A boy, paler than Sister Alma, with black hair down to his knees, silver chains hanging from his wrists, and blue and purple around his eyes. I watched them ravenously. I wished Amory was there to see it all. I prayed she'd stop being stubborn and appear. At Kotoko Airport, the faces were all kinds of brown: chestnut, mahogany, oak, chocolate, terracotta, hazel, copper, gold, umber, rosewood, ebony, coffee, onyx, dusk.
Thank you, Juliana. This is the point at which everyone is clapping. That was a beautiful reading. Imani is just so deliciously weird. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Amari, the shadow self. And just to say to the audience that the protagonist is brought up by, I think they're Carmelite nuns, is that correct? Yes, in a convent, and she's the only Black person there and certainly the only child there. And I wanted to focus on Amari because I found this childhood duo sometimes frightening. And as you say, the nuns call Amari either an imaginary friend or a demon because they don't understand her. You've talked to us a little bit about what you wanted her to do in terms of, her function in the novel. But I wondered, where does the idea come from? What are you exploring in this unique relationship between the two, between the self and the shadow self? I read an interview in which you were talking about cultural ways of knowing, which sort of links in something that Jin said about the different cultural landscapes. Can you talk to us a little bit about those cultural ways of knowing?
Yes. This is possibly going to be telling you more about what I was trying to do with her than that. But one of the things I was really interested in is Akan mysticism. So the Akan are Ghanaians, and there's this concept of the sunsum, and the sunsum is there are lots of different definitions of it, and there are lots of ways that it's explored in the book. But it's this moment where body and soul connect. It's the kind of the flame that is you. And I was interested in, as somebody who may be second generation or is definitely diasporic, whether she knows it or not, what that does to your sense of self and what it does to your consciousness, and whether she had an unconscious link to a heritage, a history, a stories that she knew nothing about. And I was interested in how she would explore that. And in the book, they appear as two people, and they talk to each other. And when Amory suggests things or indicates things that are from a different knowledge system or a different belief system, it often frightens her. But there is an interest in it, and she does want a connection with it. So it was a way of trying to explore those questions, I suppose.
And it seemed to me something that was almost quite dangerous, because it's not as if Amory is doing what Imani tells her to do. There's an independence about her that I found very interesting. So even though that link is completely clear, there's also, they're quite separate beings almost.
Yes, because I think that Imani has been raised with a very clear sense of what is good and what is wrong, what is evil, and those distinctions don't exist in the same way for Amory. They're more complicated. And so she has a sense of justice, or she has a sense of things and responds to things in the way that feels, I suppose, right to her. And Imani doesn't necessarily always understand those things, but she's also quite repressed. So in some ways, Amory is the one who acts and who responds, where Imani often hides or doesn't disclose.
Imani is sort of repressed and ravenous at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mong, I want to come back to you now, and in just continuing with that theme of sort of different cultural ways of understanding and cultural landscapes. I was really fascinated by how you approach time in your work. Sulan is a physicist, and she is, I have to say that the physics of it kind of made me nervous, because I didn't quite understand it all of the time, but I found it completely fascinating. And as I was thinking about sort of the links about these two very different novels, I wondered if the fact of writing about mothers and daughters and the shifts in geography and cultures, did that mean for you, Mong, that you had to shape time accordingly?
Wow, what a wonderful question that no one has asked me before. Thank you for that, Ella. Yes, so the book is not linear, as we discussed, right? It sort of circles and spirals, and that is related to the idea of time and Sulan's resistance to a linear relationship with time. To bring it back to what you were saying earlier about different cultures, one thing that happens in Chinese grammar is that there isn't verb tense. Verbs just are what they are, and there's no way of putting them in past or present or future tense. To do that, you sort of do it like spatially. So something will be upstream or downstream, but often there's more of a, nouns are a much bigger thing, and in the Chinese language, and often when something is said, there's just a sort of like contextual understanding that helps you situate it in time. So I think, like, after I wrote the book and thought about this, I thought, oh, maybe that was part of it. But I do think that there is something, there's something in me that just resists what comes with a linear understanding of time, that this, and also what that means for narrative and narrative structure.
I was especially fascinated because one of the things I love about reading this kind of tale of diaspora in both instances is that I feel that the language allows me to learn something about sort of perception, I think, in different cultures. And as you describe it, upstream or downstream, or the fact that Amari in Juliana's book is understood as a shadow in Ghana, and that makes perfect sense in that context. And so that was really interesting to me. And so just thinking about perception a little bit, you have several of the characters seeing ghosts as the book is moving skillfully back and forth in time. And there's also the fact that this is like an area of intellectual curiosity for Sulan herself. And your book begins with a section called The End.
Yes.
And then there's the grandmother towards the very end of the book, who is a woman who she's described as a woman who does not believe in time. Very specifically in that, there's this, I think it's a babysitter, not a grandmother, forgive me. But I think there's a very specific sense that, big revolutions will happen, famine will happen, protests will happen, but for her, life just goes on like that. So all of these big seismic changes aren't really part of it. Can you talk to us a little bit about that kind of effect of time on people, and also time in terms of sort of the living and the dead and how they interact?
Yeah, I think that one thing that I've noticed in a lot of writing from writers of my generation who are immigrants or from the diaspora is that there is much more looking towards the ancestors, while looking also towards the future. And that's definitely something that I feel like I needed to work through in this book, an understanding of how the present fit in with everything that comes before it. The reason the book starts with the end and ends with the beginning is because, well, not to over explain my own book, but I mean, even something that is that seems like a beginning, like the ultimate beginning, a birth, right? That's not really a true beginning. There are histories that come before it, people
Yes.
who come before it, stories that come before this child is born, and that I think that's why I called the beginning the end and the end the beginning. That's also related to another thing I wanted to explore in this book, just the idea of, immigrant stories and how immigrant stories are told. Often when you think of the traditional immigrant narrative, the beginning is the arrival of the immigrant in the new land. And it's almost, that arrival almost exists as a birth with nothing that comes before it. And the first life becomes a sort of, it just sort of sinks into backstory, right? That informs the new life and the present and the future and the, overcoming obstacles of assimilation. And I wanted to sort of turn that upside down and say, look, no, this isn't just the beginning. This is also the end of something, the end of the first life. And there was a whole rich, complex, convoluted self that existed when the immigrant arrived on the shores. They're not just a blank slate, even if they, like Sulan, want very badly to be a blank slate.
I thought that you did that powerfully. That was really special to me. And just keeping on that topic of the blank slate and life of the immigrant. Leah and her mother move around a lot in the US. She's a restless soul, Sulan. And while we're often given really intimate details of their lives as mother and daughter, this comes second. The idea of being in the US comes second to any focus on American life, as it were. I loved in a review, the New York Times says of the book that it expands the future of the immigrant novel. I do find myself in agreement with that, but I also wondered, what does that really mean? And did you set up, and you've just said quite clearly that you said about trying to write something that wasn't, that was turning it upside down. Would you use that phrasing? Because what was exciting to me about your book, I felt you were creating a new space, not even claiming one that existed, but creating a new space. And has that got to do with which generation of immigrant you are, or the time that we're writing in? What made you feel like this idea of an immigrant novel had to be turned upside down, be beyond that acknowledgement of a past life?
Thank you so much for saying that. I think probably a little bit of both. I said that I wanted to turn the narrative on its head, but another way that I've thought about it and described it is sort of as a negative, like a photographic negative, which I feel like sort of relates to what's going on in Juliana's book as well. The idea that what is usually dark is light, and what is usually light is dark. What's in the foreground is in the background. What's in the background is in the foreground. I think when I was, what Juliana said earlier about writing to her younger self really spoke to me as well. I think I wrote this book in this way because I hadn't found the book that I was craving to read. And at a certain point, you know, all the research I was doing, trying to find books that would help me and be a guide for me. And I found so many that were, obviously. There's, you know, so much wonderful literature out there that inspired me deeply, but nothing that was exactly what was in my head or in my heart that I wanted to make exist. And I think that's why the book is the way it is, because I wanted to write the book that I craved and not the one that existed already.
As somebody who sort of spends my whole entire life reading books, when something like your book comes across my desk and it feels new, it's so exciting. So I think you achieved that, and that's it's a wonderful treat for your readers. I wonder if you could read to us a little bit now and just tell us where you're reading from in the book and who we're encountering.
Sure, thank you. So I'm just reading from sort of near the beginning of the book. So the book is told from three different narrators. Zhu Wen, who's an older woman who's lived in Shanghai all her life on the same Longtang. And a Longtang is an alleyway in Shanghai, usually working class people are living there. And so this is from Zhu Wen's section. And she's been living in this same Longtang for all her life, and someone new has arrived. In those days, I found myself thinking often of the first time I had seen Su Lan, when she moved into the neighborhood a little less than a year before. She and her husband were strange newcomers, two intellectuals from the provinces, newlywed, young and fashionable. The Longtang didn't see many like them. In that first year, before what happened, they were spoken of with admiration and envy. Even I had felt that things were changing, that the course of possibilities was turning from one road to another. She had come first, a few days before she brought her husband. I watched her arrive in the morning, walking down the lane in a pale yellow dress and red high-heeled shoes, carrying a bucket of what turned out to be white paint. I was surprised when the stranger walked all the way to the end of the lane, and more so when footfalls made the back stairs creak. For many months, the room next door had been vacant. I had spent the years after my husband's death cultivating loneliness. I like to think I was the one who had driven prospective tenants away. She was there to paint the room white. Not just the walls, but the ceiling and the floor. She kept painting until she stood in a white box. If you squinted your eyes, the edges disappeared and the space looked like an empty plain expanding in every direction. I had never seen anything like it. There was something alarming about her. Even before she began throwing paint on the floor, her presence unsettled me, though I couldn't say exactly how or why. She had this way of looking at things, an expression, if you could call it that, with such focus and intensity, you would think she was trying to bore a hole through with her eyes. She painted in ferocious but controlled movements. Barefoot, skirt tied above her knees, she pressed layer after layer of white paint onto the walls as if aiming to annihilate every trace of what had been there before. When she finished, she stood in the middle of the room, holding the empty bucket, breathing heavily. The paint, still wet, gleamed. Later, when I went in and out of the white room, I would feel how even though the space now looked larger than it was, there was something oppressive about it, as if all the air had been squeezed out. But right then, containing just your mother, who stood there examining her handiwork, blinking with surprise and relief, the room looked brand new. So did she. She walked out, cheeks red, eyes fresh, like she had been born in this field of blankness. Here I am, she seemed to say, starting my new life. She gathered her things and locked the door. When she turned and saw me watching, she gave me a long look, her expression startled but not unkind, and mumbled something before picking up her red shoes and turning to go. I think she said, "You look like someone I've always known." Her feet were caked in a layer of dried paint. I watched their white soles pad down the stairs. It wasn't until a few days later, when she returned with her husband and other belongings, that I learned her name. "This is Sulan," her husband said. "She forgets to introduce herself." If her husband noticed the recent paint job, she didn't say anything. He opened the door, looked around, and said, "Very nice." He ran his hand down Sulan's hair. "Do you like it?" he asked her. She kissed him on the shoulder. They looked very much like a young couple in love. As far as I could tell, he believed she was seeing the place for the first time. I nearly believed it too. She behaved so differently from the other time I'd seen her, now talkative, now effusive, the sullen intensity now dissipated into charm, that I wondered if she was the same person, wondered even if I had somehow imagined the events of the previous week. Had the room always been white?
Thank you. That's just lovely, lovely. Both of you read so beautifully. I know this is all very new to you, so thank you for both of those readings. I want to talk a little bit about research and the writing process. Writing a novel is a daunting thing. I know this from working with writers, and it's also one of the reasons I think not everyone can or should be a novelist. And I just wondered how you two faced that blank page when there's nothing at all and you're just starting completely from scratch. What are some of the experiences, or what have you learned along the way, and what has helped you on the road to publication? Juliana, let's give Mong a chance to catch her breath, and could you answer that for me first?
Yes, okay. It's strange now at the end of it. There's a slight impulse to make everything seem as though it was easier than it really was. Yeah, it felt, when I first started, I think I had a lot of energy for it, and I was excited, and I had things that I wanted to explore. I had this character in mind, and I had particular places I wanted her to go and experience. But I didn't have a clear roadmap, and I went down wrong alleys. I made several misstarts. I've written and rewritten this novel so many times. And so I'm starting a new novel in a very different way. I'm trying to plan it out, to see what that's like as a process. Mm-hmm. For me, I was working on it over a number of years, and it would get to the point where I'd start working on a new piece again, and then I would discover in a box some research I did 2 years ago. I'm like, oh wow, I'd forgotten that. I did that, and then try to think about where the book is now and whether that was still relevant, and giving up on a lot of things, and not just cutting out text, but cutting out research, cutting out things that just didn't belong in the book anymore because it moved to somewhere else. Letting go of characters that were very dear to me, but didn't feel as though they were serving the story. Yeah, so it's been a meandering road, and it's taken a long time. I feel as though with this book, though, the planning came after the first draft, possibly after the second or third, because I needed to get lots and lots of story out to then start molding it and deciding what the shape would be.
I love the way that you describe the writing process and also the book itself as the completely organic sort of process, not entirely within your control. There's something quite magical about that. It's like alchemy.
But you see, that makes it sound so beautiful, but it was painful. But I like the way that sounds.
It was painful. Mong, did you experience that sense of organized magic, or how did it work for you?
Yeah, I think that funnily enough, Juliana and I have a similar process, it sounds like. There's a scene later on in my novel where a character is like trying to woo a woman by sitting outside her door for like days and he's sort of hitting his head against the wall and he's thinking that according to the laws of quantum mechanics it's actually not impossible that his head would fall through the wall. It's only improbable. And I think that's how I felt writing this book, that if I just kept hitting my head against that wall, you know, by the laws of physics, by the laws of mysterious quantum mechanics, one day I would get through it. And eventually, you know, I think in the beginning, it just felt like I was trying whatever I could. And around the time that it started feeling like not that I was just like grabbing at whatever, but that things started feeling right. You know, I started feeling, yes, this is what I need to do. I started just not listening to other people, I guess. Around that time, I realized that I was probably close to the end.
I am a big fan of that, not listening to other people at that crucial moment. I think it's a very brave decision to make with your first book, where you sort of know exactly what you want to do and you're focusing on that as well. But I think that it's really valuable that both of you have talked about the sort of the changes and the mutations that happen as you go along. And Juliana, you especially said something about what the story needed. And I think that's a really important message to get out there, sort of understanding what the story needed. I have so many more questions and I want to hang out with both of you much longer, but I'm going to move to the audience and allow other people to ask a few questions before I come back to you. I have the question here from Lucy, and it says, Juliana, the way you talk about the relationship between your protagonist and her shadow self reminds me a lot of the dynamic portrayed in J.A Mensah's Fresh Water, which draws heavily on West African folklore. Is that something you've been inspired by in your own writing? And how do you think this relates to the diasporic aspects of the self? And Lucy also says, a very long question. I'm loving this discussion.
Ella, part of the question disappeared for me.
Okay. She loves the way that you talk about the protagonist and her shadow self, and was put in mind of J.A Mensah's Fresh Water, which is drawing on Nigerian cosmology and spirituality, and wonders if that was something that inspired you.
It's on my to-read list, and and I've read about it, so it wasn't directly something that inspired me, but I think we probably will have been drawing from similar influences. So I was very conscious that, so Catholicism is a big thing in the early part of the book. And I was very conscious that I wanted to bring in a Ghanaian spiritual and mystical concept and knowledge as well, and to have those come into contact with each other without passing judgment on one or the other, putting them beside each other as different ways of being and believing, and different kinds of knowledge, and seeing her maneuver her way through that. And I think as diasporic people, we're constantly trying to make sense of the culture that we've grown up with, but also the cultures that we're from, and trying to bring those things together in a way that feels honest and healthy is something that I'm constantly thinking about and trying to write towards.
But it's interesting to me because it's a duality that anybody who has got that sense of being from here and there, wherever here and there are, learns to live with. I mean, Mong, the next question is really strongly related, and I wonder if you could answer this. It's from Anonymous, who says, this is such a fascinating conversation, so much overlap. And Anonymous wonders, what do you think about having characters with different sides of themselves being people between places and languages? Is duality inauthentic or singularity? So I think the focus there is duality inauthentic? What do you think, Mom?
I think no. I think that, well, if anything, duality perhaps is not enough alities. multiplicities, perhaps.
Mhm.
I think even people who are from one place exist in multiplicities, if only because of the way we move through time and how much the world changes. I mean, I think one of the things that drives me in my writing is, this feeling that the world is changing at a sort of hallucinatory pace. And so the self is constantly sort of chasing it and trying to adapt. So if you're alive at all, especially in these times, I'm sure that you exist in multiplicities.
Yes, that's such an important point, because it's almost like it relates for me to the fact that people who, the three of us, are often called ethnic, whereas people who are white are not, are called people, as it were, and at the same time, all human beings have that sense of, there's something else that's informing you other than what's just in front of you. I think both of you bring that out quite strongly. That was important to me. There's a question here from Deepika for Juliana. And the question, actually, it's a question that relates to something that Mong said earlier. Juliana, how did you know when you finally arrived at the story you wanted to tell after all of those drafts? Was it a feeling you had, or was it feedback from others that helped you realize that you'd got there?
So my response does relate back to something that Mong said. And there comes a point where I think I was writing several stories in one, and with each draft I was stripping away and trying to find what was the core narrative. And at some point, when I realized that feedback that I was being given was actually different to where I thought the story was going, as Mong said, when you stop listening to feedback, then I realized, actually, I understand what this story is trying to do. I know what I want it to be. And then it was about, okay, so then how do I drill down to that? And I did an event last week where I said that at the end of a particular draft, I got to the end of the story and I realized that a character had kept a secret from me. And I didn't understand why. So I went back and redrafted to try to understand why that character had hidden something from me.
I can't tell you how much I love that. I love that. And did you find out?
I did, yes.
Okay.
And it was important to find out. And I think it's things like that. It's not necessarily what I've planned to do or what I've consciously decided to write, but where the story leads you, things that I start noticing things in daily life that feel like, oh, actually that relates to this story in this particular way. Perhaps I need to read this article or read this novel or read more of a particular writer. But I start to notice things that feel like they are aligned to the story that I'm writing, and then it kind of grows from there.
The next question is from another anonymous attendee. It's a popular name, Anonymous, this evening. And it relates to research. And it's something that I certainly wanted to ask, and something that our students and other aspiring writers would be interested in. The question is, where have you both found the time to research, plan, and write your novels? Were you working, or were you able to take time out to concentrate on the books? Do you have any advice for we aspiring writers about time management when we're writing a novel? Mong, I'm going to come to you for that.
All right, good question. So when I first started writing this book, because I spent many years doing it, towards the beginning, I was working a day job, and then I went into a MFA program. And when I had those things going on, what I would do was I would get up early and write for an hour before I had to do anything else, because just for me, I found that I can only write when my mind is clear and uncluttered by all, the internet and life and distractions. A year after my MFA, I was lucky enough to get the David T.K. Wong Fellowship and come to England for 9 months, and sort of got a string of grants that allowed me to not have to work full time while I was finishing this book. And that, I mean, I was so grateful for that. And I don't know how I would have been able to write this book without that time, because I'm not a person who can multitask. And I'm not a person who's good at juggling 1,000 things. And I really need a sort of clear mind to write. I think that advice I have is, everyone has their most productive hours. For me, it's the morning. For some people, it might be nighttime or the middle of the day, and sort of to identify when you are creative and when you feel inspired, and when the muses like to visit you, and protect that time. Protect that time as best that you can.
Thank you. Juliana, can I put the same question to you?
Yes, so there are similarities between my journey and Meng's, actually. So when I started the novel, I was working full-time as an arts development officer for a local authority, and it was difficult trying to find time to do it. And then I got funding to do a PhD, and so the novel became part of that. But I was doing it part-time and working part-time as a freelancer in the arts. And I can juggle things, but only if there's an external deadline, if there's that external pressure that forces me to get things in. And the PhD was very much that, but that didn't stop it from taking years and years and years. It still took a while. And then even when I finished the PhD, I've done at least 2 more drafts of the novel. But the thing that has been happening alongside that was I started writing other things. So I've written short stories and plays. And the interesting thing I found about working in different mediums is it teaches you things about structure and about pacing. And so in writing these things, which were slightly shorter and had other external deadlines, every time I came back to the novel, I was thinking about, if I wrote a play script, I was thinking about dialogue in a slightly different way. Or if I'd just written a short story, I was thinking about structure in a slightly different way. So I felt they fed into the writing of the novel. Now I have a position at the University of York, and so I'm teaching literature and creative writing and constantly talking about it. And so I'm hoping that means I will be better at making the time to write and concentrating on the next book.
Thank you both for that. There's another question related to sort of the writing life, as it were. And my colleague John tells me I can run over a little bit. So I really want to ask these next 2 questions. So please bear with me. And this question is from Anonymous again, who wants to know, when you're writing your novels, do you still set time aside to read? And when you're reading, do you choose books which you feel would directly improve or help your own work, or you just read for your own pleasure and enjoyment, or a mixture of both? Meng? We suddenly can't hear you. Do you want to try again?
Hear me? Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay,
yes.
Sorry about that. Okay. Yes. Short answer is yes, both. I think reading is the best teacher. I mean, writing programs are great, but really, who better to learn from than the authors that you love and admire?
Can you tell us a few of the authors that you love? This is the point at which my mind always goes blank, but
right. Yes, my mind is going blank. I mean, right now I'm thinking about how I read Beloved for the first time at UEA, and how I hadn't read it during any of my formal education, but friends, and I feel sort of betrayed that I hadn't read it in my formal education. But yeah, I mean, I think like a writer like Toni Morrison, you go and read her books and her critical work and her essays, and you can learn so much, especially because of the generosity of her spirit and a way that she's able to articulate the writing process in her essays and her own process. Another writer so while I was towards the end of drafting this book, towards, you know, when you hit the slog and you're like, oh my word, I'm still working on this book and I'm sort of exhausted and bored by it. How do I make myself interested in it again? I started every day by reading a little bit of Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels, which I love, and which, you know, just reminded me of why I love literature and why I wanted to make literature.
That's a lovely, lovely answer. And Juliana, what were you reading and who are the writers you love?
So many things, and I was nodding vigorously throughout that answer. Yeah, so many people. I'm looking up and trying to think of people. So similar, Toni Morrison, Ellah Ferrante, Maya Angelou, Aminata Fauna, who else? Octavia Butler. So I think I try to read across genres and across time as well. So thinking of people, Ali Smith, Deborah Levy. There are so many, quite diverse.
Such lovely reading lists from both of you. I'm going to ask the final question, which is from Aminata. Say hello, Ms. Aminata. Nice to have you here. She says thank you, first of all, and her question is, what can you share with us, aspiring authors, about how to merge lived experience with the necessary writing skills it will take to represent them on paper? You've lived it, you've seen it happen, you want to express it, but you are new to the industry. How do you merge these realities with writing styles that can present a possibly successful piece of work? I feel that a lot of what you were saying at the beginning of our conversation answers this, but Mom, would there be anything you wanted to add about that lived experience and, you know, how you translate that into literature, as it were?
Yeah. There's an essay by Alexander Chi that I love, called How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. Oh no, that's the name of the essay collection. The essay itself is the autobiography of my novel. And in that essay, he talks about how he starts with an anecdote about a reader who asks why he didn't just write a memoir. And he answers, the things I saw in my life, the things I learned, didn't fit back into the boxes of my life, right? And I love that. I think it's also, I'm paraphrasing, he said it more beautifully than I said it. But I do think that part of, you know, finding your voice as a writer, or finding your form, finding the form of your work, is discovering the language that will enable you to tell the story that you need to tell, and discovering, you know, what that box is. I don't have any advice really, other than just keep trying and you'll get there.
That's a wonderful answer. Juliana?
Yes, I think I would echo that. When I first started this book, I actually wanted to do the opposite of that. So back then, at the time in the UK, when Black writers were writing, their work was often marketed as urban and gritty and autobiographical and exploring identity. And I told myself I didn't want to do that. And for some of the things, so it's not urban, it's not gritty, but there were some things that I found myself going into. So it does explore identity, it does explore a diasporic experience. And I think the things that you want to write about will come through. For all your best intentions, the things that you want to write about will keep presenting themselves over and over again until you can't escape them.
And characters will keep secrets from you as well. I do have one last question. We're not going to run over too much, but I can't leave this conversation without asking both of you. One of the things that was the most important to me in both books was what I felt was an uncompromising approach that you both had to dissecting the mother-daughter relationship, even in Juliana's book, where the mother and daughter don't actually know each other. She doesn't know her mother. And you both deal with death and loss and with the journey to find the truth. So in Little Gods, one character says to Leah, you are not interested in truth, you are interested in answers. And I wrote that down, and I may well have it blown up as a banner, Mong, because I thought it was so beautiful. Can you talk to us a little bit about that particular line and what it means to you and why it was important, Mong? And Juliana, just advance warning, I'm going to ask you to answer the same question around the difference between truth and answers. Mong.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of what literature is to me, you know, truth, not answers, and everything that you can get from the arts and the non-factual, as it were. In the case of that scene, you know, I think that I thought of the character is telling Leah because Leah's on this, she's gone back to China and she's fixated on finding out who her father was. And the character who tells her you're interested in truth, not answers, sort of sees that or you're not interested in truth, you're interested in answers, sort of sees that she's looking at one thing while ignoring the elephant in the room, right? Ignoring the grief and the fact that, you know, even though her mother was alive, she most of her life she didn't get the chance to know her. And so I think, yeah, that in the context of where it comes up in this book, it's about grief and how grief can blind you. But in a larger context, I think I'm, you know, interested in what can feel true that can't be, you know, pinned down by numbers and facts.
Yeah, thank you. Juliana.
I think often answers don't necessarily give us the truth, or they feel unsatisfying. And it's what Meng was saying about what literature does, that it's a fiction that speaks to a greater truth. And so I think for me in the book, it was about what is the essence of this thing? What is the spirit of this thing that is real, that I understand, that is beyond a cultural understanding or is beyond the facts as they are presented by any one individual? What's the truth that we can all connect to?
Yes, yes. I'm so grateful to both of you. First of all, you've enriched my life immeasurably with your books. Thank you very much. They were such a pleasure to read. And also, I had a hunch that they would be a conversation and common feeling or common intent between the two of you. And you've really expressed that. You took the time to read each other's books and really engage with them. I'm so grateful to you because it made the whole event you know, really exciting and meaningful. And to the audience, thank you so much for joining us. And I want to thank the Centre for New Writing and the Creative Manchester Initiative and Blackwell's books as well. But mostly, Juliana and Meng, I want to congratulate both of you. I cannot wait to see what you will do next. And hope we can meet in person soon. And inviting all of you to join us for our next Novel Voices debut duo, and look forward to it very much. But meanwhile, enjoy your reading Castles from Cobwebs and Little Gods. Thank you all very, very much.